Hey, Ann.
Okay. Welcome to our session, Unhappy in Its Own Way. I'm Anna Sepstein, the moderator, and one of the readers. Our title validates Leo Tolstoy's first sentence in Anna Karenina, that all happy families are alike, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. A statement most, if not all of us, can agree with. During the pandemic, we spent more time than usual the past 2 years in close quarters with those we think of as family. While the experience has brought some people together, it has also revealed and even widened the fractures in these relationships. Our event features 6 Viennese Press authors who offer distinct pictures of familial disarray and its repercussions on partners, children, extended family members, and friends. Nowadays, we label them dysfunctional families, a term that was coined in 1958, but didn't become popular until the 1980s. Each author will read briefly from their work, followed by a question from me. Then we'll open it up to questions from the audience, which you can post in the Q&A at any time. Questions can be addressed to a specific author or to the group in general. To learn more about the 6 books in today's event and Viennese Press's other publications, which includes fiction, memoir, poetry, essays, and books on the craft of writing, please visit the Viennese Press website, which is posted in the chat and in the event description on the SMOL website. Now, let's get started. Our first author is Rusty Allen, reading from Ella's War. The title character in this forthcoming novel fends for herself and her child when her restless common-law husband Lee takes off to fight in World War II. Ella saves their farm with the help from a German POW with whom she falls in love, leaving her to make a heartrending decision when Lee returns. Russ?
Thank you, Anne. And thanks everyone for tuning in. My novel takes place during World War II, mostly in the US. The main character is Ella Hall, a young mother who has inherited her parents' farm in southern Delaware and is trying to keep it going with the help of her beau, Lee Tingle, who is the father of her son. The book is told from 4 points of view: Ella's, Lee's, their son Reese, and their German POW farm laborer. The book starts with a flash forward to 1943, when Ella's 10-year-old son Reese is fishing out in a skiff on the Delaware Bay and takes a terrible fright when a German U-boat surfaces right next to him, and he witnesses its surrender at the town's naval and army pier. The book then opens 15 months earlier with part 1, entitled The Calling. I'll read the short section that is the first scene in chapter 1. January 1942. Ella Hall threw on her shawl and went to the barn to find Lee. She used her hands to keep her hair from whipping into an even worse bird's nest in the bitter wind coming from northeasterly and off the bay today. She found Lee working on a wagon he decided needed back in duty. She slid the barn door closed behind her quickly so he wouldn't see that she had to put all her weight into it. "Reese in school?" Lee croaked, barely looking up after she stood there for a minute. Of course he was, and Lee knew it perfectly well. "Let me help," Ella said. He'd taken one of the struts off the undercarriage of the wagon. "What you gonna do, straighten her out for me?" He laughed and picked up his square head hammer again, held at the end of a forearm as strong as a steel cable. "Lee, if you won't treat me like a wife, at least treat me like a partner." both of which Ella believes she was. Married in the eyes of authority anyway, common law spouses, not official, but bound as they'd been for 9 years by that mischievous form of life, an example of a boy who would return to them at the end of this livelong day with that darling bounce to his step. All of them tied together now in another way too, by this place. I didn't ask them to go like that, Ella said. Her parents, so fast, so early, so close together, untimely, and now leaving her with this farm and with Lee, who had been by her side intermittent over the years, and thank goodness here since the spring and mostly running this farm this past season. She only wished her man would meet her eyes now, but he was struggling to hold the strut at an angle to hit it just right. She grabbed the other end to steady it. He locked her gaze for a moment, then hauled off and banged again. She could do so much more if he would only let her try. Like walk straight off this place if she took a mind. She'd gotten experience helping to keep a woman's dress shop over in Georgetown in those last 2 years of high school before she'd started to show, after this bear of a man had seeded Reese into her tummy. He had finished Henlopen High 2 years ahead of her and ought to have known better than to take a chance like when they rolled together in the warm sand dunes behind the beach. But glad he had, and it had been different and fresh between them then, and could be again if only they would try and he would let it. Stand off, woman, he said, straightening up and inspecting the strut. But this was his work, everything it took to run a spread like this. He'd helped her family off and on ever since Reese had been born, more on lately, thankfully. But how he could work out here in this cold today, she could not understand. Not knowing what else to do now, she reached for the push broom to help clean up the shop floor when, boom, everything in the shed rattled and they stopped for a second, then relaxed again. Knowing this sound by now, the guns at Fort Miles out near the Cape, not but a mile or two away, target practice from the artillery batteries. For a year, they'd witnessed the fort going up as other countries had gone to war in Europe and the Pacific. But still, even though he'd heard it so many times, Lee paused and listened in that direction. Ella shoved the broom across the floor, thanking goodness for the draft deferments. Farmers were too valuable to the war effort to pull them away. But as the two worked now, the wind blew outside again and came in through the chinks in the shed. This week's newspapers fluttered around Lee's workbench, where, of course, he left them open to the war news again. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Russ. I have a question for you that I think readers are likely to ask. The main character, Ella, seems like a straight shooter and faithful. What combination of factors tempt her to betray her marriage?
Yes, that's a central question in the book, Anne. What causes anyone to step out on a relationship? In Ella's case, the father of her son won't marry her. They got pregnant together when barely out of high school, and he has resisted being tied down. He's a good person, but pent up and afflicted by what today we'd probably call toxic masculinity. When he decides to give up his farm deferment and enlists and heads off to the war in Europe, their relationship is hit with all those stressors that so often affect military families, especially during war: separation, miscommunications, failed communications, doubts, changes, and particularly in this story, temptations, when Ella is thrown together working on her farm with a man who is very different than Lee.
So thanks. It sounds like a great book, I think, probably especially for people who are interested in the Second World War and historical fiction in general.
Thank you.
Our second author is Kate Brandt. Her forthcoming novel, Hope for the Worst, is about Ellie Atkins, a young woman stuck in a dead-end job whose parents are divorced and whose boyfriend has left her. Ellie yearns for enlightenment, Yet her affair with her Buddhist teacher and father figure Calvin, who has also abandoned her, makes salvation seem farther away than ever. Kate?
Thank you, Anne. So I'm going to read a short scene, and in this scene, Ellie is having a flashback. I teach adult literacy, and I often tell my students that the main character in almost every story has a problem. Ellie's story is that she's in love with someone who doesn't love her back, so she's thinking a lot about love. And in this scene, she's having a flashback to her life before her parents were divorced. A scene. I am standing with my mother in my parents' bedroom. Twin beds pushed together, white chintz bedspreads, windows overlooking the backyard, which stretches out to the row of lilac bushes that border our yard from others. My mother is in her blue seersucker nurse uniform. We are folding laundry. She smells of lemons. We have just been at the dinner table, an hour of silence. My father had received a rejection for a grant proposal, and every time my mother said anything, he looked past her at the wall as if he had not heard anything. It was her face I could not stand, which with each thing she said into the silence, it became more drawn, the bones pushing upward through the skin. It had happened before. There is a rejection, and my father will not speak to us. Those times my mother and I stuck together, busied ourselves with house chores. If we kept acting like it, everything would be fine. But this day I am inflamed with the injustice of it. Dad shouldn't not talk to us, I say. I say this importantly. I know she will agree, my mother, who is all about goodness. But she doesn't seem to know what I'm talking about. She looks at me, her face far away. He's just upset, honey. But he shouldn't treat us this way. This is what my mother believes. People should be friendly, so I know I'm on safe ground. You don't deserve it. My mother has just finished folding the arms of a shirt back, placing it on the pile. She smiles absently. Well, she says finally, when you love someone, you have to accept them the way they are. I don't understand it. For my entire life, my mother has been talking about the obligations of goodness. Shouldn't he love us back? I say hotly. Shouldn't he treat us better? My mother is looking out the window. She doesn't answer. When she looks back at me, I see that she understands something I don't. Love isn't about what you get, honey, she says. Love is just, she shrugs, you just love. She is looking out the window, but she is not seeing what's there. My mother has a vision of a better world. Maybe it was that, the thing I couldn't see, that I have been going toward all this time. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for that gut-wrenching scene, Kate. I have a question for you. What was your process in writing this book?
So this book took me many, many years to write. And I don't feel like I did it alone. I felt like my writing group helped me write it. And I feel like they are the best friends I could ever ask for, because they believed in me when I didn't. They kept sending it back and saying, you're not there yet. And I didn't think I could get there, but they did. And so I'm full of gratitude for them.
Well, I will share that shout out for our writers group.
Yes.
Our next author is Martha Engber, whose novel Winter Light is the story of 15-year-old Mary Donahue, a motherless girl raised by an uneducated alcoholic father. On the cusp of failure during Chicago's brutal winter of 1978-79, Mary is desperate to save herself and so reaches out to an unlikely source, a classmate from a nice, normal family. Martha?
Thank you, Anne. Chapter 1, Tuesday, December 12th, 1978. Mary lay with her cheek against the school desk, staring into the winter dusk. Bare tree limbs looked black against the ash sky, tinged with the orange of a sinking sun. Everyone said this winter would be bad, the worst in recent history. Real scary boogeyman shit. The cold, colder than the coldest. The snow, deeper than the deepest. The coldest and deepest in years, maybe since the Ice Age. Whistling winds, blizzards, ice sheet highways, one prediction bleaker than the last. Whatever came would have to be a real whopper of catastrophe, though, because you don't grow up in this old Chicago suburb on the Burlington Northern Line without knowing the meaning of frigid. And you don't survive 15 years with 3 older brothers and a worthless, his glasses glaring all the time, alcoholic father without knowing how to dig yourself out from under. But then she narrowed her eyes because Mother Nature could be a mean bitch, even on days when nothing much happened. Like today, no blizzard, no limb-tearing wind, yet look at the muted glow of that dying sun. The sky bleeding out slowly, quietly, alone, like the work of a serial killer. She didn't bother looking at the clock above the classroom door, the time always 11:59, forever on the verge, because nobody bothered to fix the thing. Mr. O'Brien had ducked out 20 minutes ago, saying he needed something from the office, when everybody knew he went to have a smoke in the teacher's lounge. The time must be close to 3 when the bell would ring. She turned her head and rested her other cheek on the desk. She studied the girl in the next seat over, the same girl who always sat in that same seat, probably even on the days Mary ditched. Though the girl had to be 15 too, she looked 12, what with the skinny body and flat chest. She read with one hand on her forehead and an elbow lodged on a stack of books. She wore a white button-down shirt beneath a dark blue wool sweater with a ring of small whales circling the collar. And how everything matched too. Jesus. The sweater with the corduroys with the socks with the ribbon that kept a perfect curl of brown bangs off her face. But the shoes gave her away. No real prep would be caught dead wearing cheap Oxford knockouts with a dweeby wedge heel. That made the girl a wannabe. And the only thing worse than a prep was a fucking prep wannabe. Mary lifted her head and with 2 fingers flipped a strand of long strawberry blonde hair over her shoulder. You got the time? The girl looked up. Mary counted 3 O's, 2 made by the girl's surprised brown eyes and the third by her prissy, lip-glossed mouth. The time, Mary said. The prep looked at her watch. 5 to 3. Thanks. The girl returned to reading. Mary looked out the window again. The sinking sun meant the temperature would drop soon too, probably to near 0. Yet she had no ride waiting for her, so she'd do what she always did and walk home. She'd cross the street and cut through the hole, a wooded lot good parents forbid their kids to cut through, especially after that girl got murdered there last summer. She'd been a loser with dirty hair and a bad complexion, but even so, nobody deserved to be strangled. Mary would continue along 47th Street as the streetlights blinked on and the headlights of oncoming cars flashed across her chest. She'd walk by the same houses she passed every day, middle-class jobs of stucco and brick. While most looked nice, every block had at least one dump like the one where she lived. A place where though you switch on the overhead light in your room, the cold and dark remain inside of you. So you smoke and listen to your favorite album, Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon, a gift from your best older brother, Danny. And somehow you try not to stop thinking about death. When you're only 15 and have your whole life ahead of you, you're not supposed to dwell on strangled dead girls or guys like Terry Kath, the guitarist for Chicago, who just croaked of an accidental self-inflicted gunshot wound. Bang! She jerked, the pulse in her neck throbbing with the sudden race of her heart. The sound she'd heard had been somebody coughing. Just a cough, not a gunshot. Christ, what was wrong with her? A drop of sweat snaked down her back beneath her black Ted Nugent t-shirt. She thought of taking off her midi-length wool coat with the trampled fake fur collar, but the bell would ring soon, So she sit and do nothing and pretend she didn't care, as always, maybe forever. Then the woman would be prep, cleared her throat, the sound quiet and polite. Mary considered the girl again, though longer this time and without blinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. It's a powerful book. You also have a memoir coming out, and its title is Bliss Road, and that comes out next year in 2023. How does your story tie into Mary's story?
Well, Mary has what is an obvious dysfunctional family. The dad is alcoholic, and she has an obvious litany of poor behavior based upon negligent parenting. But I fortunately was not from a family that was so obviously dysfunctional. But what I've learned is that every single family has some form of dysfunction. In my case, it was a dad who was undiagnosed high-functioning autism, and which caused some problems. And so the point of my memoir is to suggest that you do like Mary does and chase down the source of that dysfunction and face it, and then you can live a much happier life just based on that. So that's the connection. That even if somebody's family looks perfect, it's not. We all have our challenges.
Hence the title of our session.
There you go. Thanks a lot, Anne.
Yeah, looking forward to the new book too.
Thanks, Anne. Bye-bye.
So the next author is me. My novel, The Great Stork Derby, is based on a real but bizarre event in 1926. When a rich man leaves his fortune to the Toronto woman who has the most babies in the 10 years after his death, a husband pressures his wife to enter the contest. 50 years later, widowed and ailing, he must make amends with his distant offspring. So to set the scene for this excerpt, told by his doctor that he can no longer live alone, ailing widower Mbembo is faced with two choices: go to an old age home, which terrifies him, or live with one of his many children from whom he's alienated. Here he recalls how his predicament began. Nearly 50 years ago, on a day as bleak as this one, M had raced into the kitchen of their tiny apartment. Azora, 8 months pregnant with their first child, was resting her swollen belly against the pitted, grimy counter. He slowly waved the Toronto Daily Star in front of her pinched face so she could see the headline. Rich eccentric's will promises fortune to woman having most babies in 10 years. Azar turned off the water and listened as he read the article. The estate of Charles Vance Miller will pay a grand prize to the woman who gives birth in Toronto to the greatest number of children as registered under the Vital Statistics Act in the decade following his death on October 31st, 1926. Mr. Miller, who has no heirs, described his will as necessarily uncommon and capricious, and proof of my folly in gathering and retaining more than I required in my lifetime. The prize, now worth $100,000, is to be invested, with the actual award based on its value at the time the winner is declared. In the event of a tie, the prize will be equally divided. Ladies and the gentlemen who service them, on your marks, get set. The Great Stork Derby has begun. The rest of the article described how Miller, an oddball real estate investor and barrister, delighted in exposing greed. A favorite prank was to leave dollar bills on the sidewalk and watch passersby furtively pocket them. His will also awarded shares in the Ontario Jockey Club two pillars of the community who railed against gambling and needed joint ownership of a house in Jamaica to three fellow lawyers who detested each other, provided they lived in it together. Goodness, Zora laughed. I can't tell if Mr. Miller was meaner, crazier, or simply had a weirder sense of humor than average. Whichever, he was certainly richer. M wrapped his arms around his wife, just barely. Honey, what if we went after the prize and got rich too? With our first due next month, we've got a head start. The baby kicked and Zora moved M's hands so he could feel that restlessness too. They smiled at the moving bump in her belly. I don't know, Em. We both want a family, but shouldn't we take it slower? If we lose, we'll be stuck with more mouths to feed than we can afford, or than we want. Zora had only one brother, whereas Em had three brothers and two sisters. Zora pictured them having something in between. My parents weren't rich, but we managed. Besides, it was fun growing up in a madhouse with 6 kids, always someone to play with or fight with or drive my folks crazy with. Em pressed his hands against his wife's stomach, but the baby had settled down. He watched Zora stare past the doorway to 2 bedrooms and a sitting room, then back to the Eaton kitchen. Just think about everything we'll be able to give our children when we win the prize money. She frowned. If we win, even supposing we do, where would we raise them all in the meantime? By the time our second child is born, I'll buy us a place of our own. Zora accused Em of talking big, but it was also one of the things that attracted her to him. I was going to wait until we were snuggled in bed to tell you, but I'll spill the beans now to convince you I can take care of things. He spread a fistful of dollars on the table. Mr. Withers did the books this afternoon and promoted me to foreman. Toaster sales are up 20% and exports could triple next year. Oh, Em, that's wonderful. Zora clapped. The baby wriggled again. Now we can start to save money every month. Em had thrust out his stomach and waddled, anticipating the smile his wife usually bestowed when he imitated her condition. Instead, Zora eased into a chair and kneaded her lower back. It sounds exciting, but I'm worried. We could end up jinxing this baby before it's even born by planning the next one. And the next, and the next. Em tried to pull his wife into a standing position so he could dance her around the table. When she resisted, he'd shimmied across the kitchen by himself. Where's the spunky girl I married? He and Zora had grinned at each other. They both knew she'd never been spunky. Determined, yes, but cautious, in contrast to his devil-may-care spirit. Ask me again in a month, Em, after we're sure our first baby is born healthy. Em had given her a thumbs up and turned to the paper's racing page. Mr. Miller had a good head for business. Maybe I should invest our savings in the Ontario Jockey Club. So this question for myself was originally posed by my 9-year-old grandson. He asked, what inspired you to write this book? I would answer that all my writing is inspired by 2 things. First, I'm drawn to history's little-known quirky events and to how big events affect small, ordinary lives. The Stork Derby was an oddity, and the novel follows the family for 50 momentous years that include the Depression, World War II, and the social unrest of the 60s. My next book, One Person's Loss, which is due out in September, also begins with a weird but true event, an exhibit of incubator babies at Coney Island. In the book, German Jewish refugees argue about adopting one of the babies to replace those lost or unborn in the Holocaust. Second, I love the challenge of making unlikable characters sympathetic. M, the husband in The Great Stork Derby, can be a nasty piece of work, obsessed with winning, insensitive to his wife, and hypercritical of his offspring. And yet, I really care about this guy. Carson McCullers, who wrote about society's outcasts, said, "How can you create a character without love and the struggle that goes with love?" And ultimately, that's what The Great Stork Derby is about. Our next author is Joanne Nelson. Her memoir, This Is How We Leave, is about how a desire to stay competes with the lure of leaving a family whose history includes a great-grandfather who disappears, a grandfather who strays, and a father who walks away. Nelson dives deep into her own role and culpability in a childhood marked by disruption, emotional abuse, and parental alcoholism. Joanne?
Thanks, Anne. So I am going to read a short chapter from This Is How We Leave, and the chapter is called Just a Hum in the Background. Here we go. At night, my mother and I crawled into her bed with potato chips and a bowl of her homemade dip between us. The family dog, always hopeful at our feet, tail thumping. We ignored his begging and concentrated on our reading material. Me with my Little House books, Mom with her Good Housekeeping and McCall's. A radio taking up most of the nightstand played next to her. The host's voice soothing and indistinct, just a hum in the background. My mother listened closely though, and looked up from her magazine if callers with familiar problems got through to her favorite call-in show. The women upset about their hearts racing every time they left the house or their husbands not listening to them were her favorites. She'd lift her hand in a be quiet signal if I crinkled the potato chip bag too loudly, her head turned toward the wood console of the radio as if listening to a friend. Every now and then my father peeked in with a comment. "It's a damn library in here," he'd say, or "When's she going to bed?" Then he'd shake his head and return to the basement and his television. Back to the shows he watched from an easy chair, a bottle of Pabst clutched tight against his body. Sometimes we'd find him asleep like that, chin drooping to his chest, rising and falling with each breath as if in a continuous nod, some constant agreement with the room, the bottle of beer tilting, but never spilling. He was wrong about it being a library in there. We had that radio after all, the confident male questions and hesitant feminine answers giving the evening a certain cadence. And there was our creamy onion dip and the bag of salty chips on the blanket between us as we read. One chip after another dipped into the dish, our hands occasionally colliding when we reached in at the same time. The thunk of my mother's wedding ring against the side of the metal bowl. A harsh sound in the quiet bedroom. Thanks for coming to our reading.
Thanks for that great reading, Kate. So you also have a new book coming out titled My Neglected Gods. What can you tell us about it? And are there connections to This Is How We Leave?
Yeah, thanks, Anne. Thanks for asking. So, My Neglected Gods is a book of prose and poems and poetry that plays with what we count as important and what we pay allegiance to, whether that's coffee or chocolate or a glass of wine or our garden or our church. and even how we sometimes have to leave those things that we once called important. And so that's one of the connections about making our choices about what we name as important. And I think that another way they connect is simply that they have some of the same characters, some themes and places. Place is an important part in this book also. So, and that's coming out in July of 23. Thanks.
Thanks, Joanne. Another book to look forward to. Our final author is Frederick Zucker, whose novel Blood Up North is about a young woman from Minnesota's backwoods who, having agreed to help her brother hide cash she stole from a drug dealer, must fend off their corrupt cop uncle, lawless cousins, and vicious father. To protect herself, she is forced to employ the very evil she has grown up despising.
Thanks so much, Anne. This is from the start of the book. Cass stood in the dancing firelight of the basement wood stove, scowling at the square wood chute door. Above, her grandma's feet shuffled along the kitchen linoleum. Cass centered the bologna sandwich in her hoodie pouch, zipped her faded pink coat up to her chin, quietly opened the door and crawled into the narrow tin chute. When the metal dinned, she lay still and waited for a minute before worming her gaunt and boyish physique through the wooden double doors and onto the front lawn, still frozen from morning dew. Minnesota's late autumn twilight choked the world a bloodless gray. She brushed the dirt and twigs from her jeans, tied her long, stringy, russet hair at the back of her neck with a rubber band, and tucked the ponytail into her coat. Her neck was acne scarred, her upper body slightly concave. Her tiny syrup brown eyes were somber and meek, and with the skin around them wrinkled from the hurt that stole her youth, she looked much older and younger than 19. She snuck along the front of Tilly's house and met her older brother near the back entrance to the garage. On one shoulder, he carried a tattered black canvas backpack, on the other, a rifle. With his meaty, windburned hands, he gripped a spade he'd taken from the garage. No one had seen him in several days. During that time, all types of rumors had spread around Bacchus. She tried not to listen to them. "Tilly see you leaving?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Don't think so," she said. "Did she?" he growled. She glared at him. "No, Jack, I snuck out the old way. What's in the backpack?" He grunted and spat. He looked into the backyard clearing. "You got your phone with you?" he asked, ignoring her question. "Yeah," she said. "Good, don't want her snooping while you're out." He was tall and broad-chested, but chicken-legged. He wore black bib snow pants and a camouflage duck hunting jacket. Chew spit was frozen to his beard. Even through the cold of dusk, she could smell on him liquor and campfire smoke. He adjusted his stocking cap and smirked down at her, his green eyes barely open. "Where you been?" she asked. "Can't even begin to tell you," he replied. "You better, Jack. And what's the shovel for?" "Digging." "Digging what?" "A hole." He yawned and grinned. "Ain't for no grave, if that's what you're thinking." When she stepped closer to him and handed him the sandwich, she looked his face over. His eye bags, which swept over his cheeks, were puffy and violet. Dried blood coated a gash on his brow, and flecks of vomit clung to the corners of his mouth. His eyes were so foggy and grim and fatigued, he seemed to her a stuffed carcass. "It's the withdrawals," he said preemptively. After folding the sandwich in half and devouring it in 2 bites, he asked her if she was ready to walk. She replied, "I ain't going no further if you won't tell me what's going on. Why does everyone got it in their heads that you're either dead or close to it? Tilly hears the most horrible things. Every night she's yapping at me." He spat again. "Forget everything Tilly said. Her brain's full of worms. Say, you got any cigarettes?" She said, "You realize, don't you, I've been sitting around wondering if my brother was alive or not?" "Well, don't be dramatic, Cass. Anyway, hopefully everyone can just think I'm dead for now. That'd keep us all safe." "Right, I'm the dramatic one," she shot back. "You gonna help me or not, Cass? He handed her the spade, started away from the house toward the clearing in the back acres, his boots crunching over frigid folds of grass. She crossed her arms and stayed put. Over his shoulder, he said, "For now, I'll tell you just what you need to know. I'm doing this for you. You might even thank me for it later on." For half a minute, she stood watching him walk away. She glanced back at the house, then followed him, holding the spade on her shoulder like a rifle. They kept to the edge of the clearing, walking past firewood piles long dried out, over lazy hillocks of long grass and reeds, through mobs of stripped and scraggly oak, of serried pines. The cold numbed her face and her nose began to run. As the wind picked up and sparse snowflakes waltzed down from the canyon of boughs above, she noticed he was limping and his shoulders were tensed up just below his ears. When they reached the far end of the clearing and ventured into the forests of birch and popple and red oak and spruce, she caught up to him. "How much money's in there?" she asked. "Why, you figure it's money, Cass." "Either money or mess, and you'd have shot up by now. How much?" she pressed him. "Plenty for a long while, I figure," he said. "Quiet now. All you got to know is where I'm putting it." That's the end of my reading.
Thanks, Frederick. I must say, I can not only see and hear the characters, I can smell them in the way that you describe. Very, very vivid. The subject matter of Blood Up North sounds dark. Would you say that it's a dark novel?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously the theme and the plot is quite dark. I also think there's an element of there's a comedic element to it. I would sort of compare it to Fargo and how people from the Midwest and Minnesota in particular viewed that film versus how people outside of the Midwest and in particular Minnesota viewed that film. Whereas outside of Minnesota, people thought, "Oh wow, what a drama! What a wild story! Those people are nuts." And people in Minnesota thought, "Wow, this is hilarious! These people are nuts." And I think there's something of that dynamic to Blood Up North. I grew up in and around the Brainerd Lakes area, and spent some time in Bacchus, and I think people from there would get kind of a kick out of it. Hopefully.
Okay, well,
Thank you.
I'm a Michigander, so I'm prepared to laugh. So
Excellent.
thanks. Okay, now I'd like to invite all of our authors to come back on. Okay, and we're going to open up the session to your questions in the Q&A, which Russ will read, and you can continue to add questions. And again, they can be for individual authors about their current or forthcoming books, or they can also just be for the group as a whole. So do we have any questions? I noticed a lot of comments in the chat, but are there any questions in the Q&A?
And while we wait, oh, okay, so we've got one already. So this question comes from Aliana Batista Parsons. And she asks, how many of you interviewed people as part of your research?
I think all of us, right? I mean, it's kind of a necessary part of researching, even though you can find a lot of stuff on the internet. I remember back in the days, and probably all of you can, 20 years ago, that researching was all about getting books out of the library and making copies of things out of magazines and stuff. And so the internet is a writer's dream, in my opinion. So what about the rest of you?
Yeah, I mean, I feel the same way. A lot of my fiction would be considered historical fiction. And the internet just makes that so much easier, not having to go to the library. But what you often don't get from that kind of research are the very personal details that can make a scene, just come alive. And for that, being able to talk to people who either lived in the time and place that you're writing about, or who have been through the kinds of experiences that you're writing about. It adds a whole different layer of authenticity, I think, to what we write.
I have an older brother I'd interview sometimes when I was trying to remember some detail from our home. And the funny thing is he's 9 years older than me, and he would often have completely opposite things to say than I expected. And I'd be like, you're wrong. But so that was kind of humorous. Or and sometimes what he had to say would lead me to some other material that I never expected to write about or think about. So it's kind of fun calling for questions. But I guess like being a lawyer, don't ask anything you don't want the answer to.
Yeah.
I'm kind of piggybacking off of that as well. Oh, sorry, Russ. I was going to say I had the luxury of growing up with a family of lunatics, and that really informed my work here in Blood Up North. Some of the lunatics are here with us, so I won't use their names. I don't want to embarrass them, but they know who they are.
You already said hi, Mom. So
That's
yes,
true. I
okay.
outed myself.
Right.
She definitely knows. Hi, Mom. Just kidding, Mom. Love you.
So Russ, what were you gonna
Yeah,
say?
I'll just say I'll be the exception. I did not interview anyone, but my family has a generations long connection to Sussex County, Delaware, which is a very rural area. So I knew it, and it's really for me more being associated with the culture. I understood the culture, and I also, well, the plot of the book involves a German POW, and he is an officer off a surrendered German U-boat. I lived for a while in Kiel, West Germany, which was one of the two main berthing locations for German U-boats, and that history is deeply embedded there. So it gave me a sense of that culture as well, and I was able to kind of meld the two through my characters. Okay, do we want to go to another question?
Sure.
Okay, so we have one from Jimin Han, and the question is, let's see, well, I guess that answer, that question just went away. So we'll go to the next question, which is from Pam, and the question is,
her question, sorry to interrupt, Russ, but I think her question is in the regular chat. She asked, what was the revision process for all of you? Did your novels change substantially from your first draft?
yeah, she must have moved it to the chat. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So I'll just start, and I will say that I had a very long revision process. And what I do is try to make it as good as I think it can possibly be, and then show it to my writers group, and they are my eyes and see all the blind spots. And, it's a long process to get it where it needs to be. And I think you just have to have those other readers who can look at what you've made from the outside. Does anyone else want to talk about that?
Well, I'll say it's people ask me how much I revise, and it's a difficult question to answer. Some people sort of get it all down, and then they go back and revise and revise. And some of us revise a lot as we go. And I'm more a reviser as I go, like after each round of feedback from my writers group, it's like I have to sort of clean up what I've done so far before I can move ahead. Although I keep something that I call a parking lot, which is as I get ideas that aren't necessarily about the section that I'm working on, I'll jot them down in a file called my parking lot, so I'll know to get to it later. But the Great Stork Derby, actually, it began as a short story that was just it took place within the 10 years of the Stork Derby. And it was written from the wife's point of view. So I would say the biggest revision from the story into the novel was not only that the novel is set 50 years later, but it's told from the husband's point of view. And unlike the poor put upon wife, who's automatically a very sympathetic, worn out character, changing the point of view, it can be really a major aspect of a revision that totally changes the way you and your readers see the story.
I'll say that it's just probably something that you've noticed too, as you've become a more experienced writer, but my process has really switched. When you're first writing, you aren't sure of everything that needs to be there. And so it takes a long time. You write things down and then you're like, oh, I forgot that. And you got to go back. And because you changed that one thing back there, now you got to change everything that goes forward. So you've got that back and forth going on, and it, many painful revisions. But the more experienced you go, your planning gets better. And you understand what needs to be there, and you start working out the actual structure of it, and you make sure that those details are going to be there, so that you don't have to change as much, right? You don't have to go back and say, oh, I forgot that detail, I got to put it in there. So it's gotten to be much more efficient, much more thoughtful. So it's, for me, 95% planning, 5% writing now. Really, really careful, really detailed going, so anyway, what's your
I would agree with that. I've become a huge acolyte of extensive outlining before writing the first word of the book, in detailed, outline to tens of thousands of words if you need to, and that's the planning aspect that helps you avoid extensive revisions when you've sort of gone down the wrong path, on an inspiration that doesn't necessarily hold together for the whole structure.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
Kate, your response is good. Sorry, I just saw Kate's response in the chat. You want to speak about that, Kate? Is that you, right?
Oh,
Oh,
she's muted.
You're
I
muted, Kate.
Yeah, I just said that I can never make an outline. It's not that I don't think it's a good idea, but I always struggle with what's going to happen next. So writing for me is like life. I don't know what's going to happen next, and I just have to hope that it comes to me.
Yeah, I think probably the one of the most important lessons I've learned as a writer is that there are no shoulds.
Yeah.
There's always advice, oh, you should do it, this way.
Right.
Your guts, clean it up later, or plan everything out. And I think we each find a method that works for us. I'm not somebody, I don't like to face a blank page. I start out with a general outline that starts to become more and more refined. Also, before I even start to write it, things may change a lot as I write. But that's the style of mine that evolved and feels comfortable. And there are people in my writers group who, they sit down, they don't know what's going to come out that day, but something does, and eventually it gets shaped.
I think for nonfiction, I revise a lot, and I love when I get a first draft down, because it's like, whew, I can still write something. It's often very different than the finished product as I go through and try to figure, I don't know, what really still fits in the river of the piece, what's a tributary, what's a whole different ocean, and needs to be something else. And I like to go by mood with what I'm writing, and then kind of maybe in a year or two gather it all together and see how it fits and works together. But for me, there's a lot I can revise for years on a piece.
Yeah.
Okay. We have another question. which is kind of a fun one. It's I believe it is, how do you go about choosing your characters' names?
Go ahead. Anybody want to start with this?
Yeah, for me, that's one of the most fun things. Is to do it, and especially for the main characters, I want them to be memorable. And since I write a lot of historical fiction, I'll often at least do some research about names that were popular at the time that they were born or in the place where they were born. And then I twist them around a little bit so that there's just something a little bit unusual and memorable. And, sometimes, often you want them to be consistent with the character in the background. But it's naming characters is kind of like playing God. We are literally creating people. So
yeah, I think probably everybody uses it. When you go to the internet, you gotta love baby naming books, and especially baby naming lists, and especially if it's people from different regions or cultures or anything like that. You gotta love that. And I try to look for, because one of the best things that it used to be, and they don't even do phone books, but phone books were by far the best, because you would go down there and you would find tons of really weird names that you wouldn't find on a baby naming list, like Hunker Johnson. And you're like, where did that come from? And, and you can't make it up. It's so good. So that kind of thing. And of course, everybody loves to choose a really cool meaning for their characters, because it's a private joke. And, or in my case of Mary Donahue, I went to school with a ton of Irish kids, Irish and Eastern European kids. So Polish and Irish were big. So Mary Donahue, full on Irish. In any case. Anybody else? Any other ideas? Anything I should be using the next time I name my characters?
I have some people I change their names even though it's nonfiction. And for me, I'll usually try to do something that's the same number of syllables, and because it's easier for me to remember, and I keep a list of that. And of course, names that would be generationally appropriate, like if I was giving a different name to one of my daughters, I probably wouldn't choose Barbara, because Barbara is more my generation, or so I'm careful about that when I do that for nonfiction.
I'll also mention I name things other than my characters. I know if the rest, I name my cars. Occasionally, if I have recalcitrant body parts, I will name them, so I can talk to them soothingly. And my laptop is named Alice in honor of Alice Munro. So.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So names hold significance.
I'll say that the names that come to you just out of nowhere tend to be the best. I think they just come from some divine subconscious area. And if you immediately know this is the name of the character without having to associate it with any particular person or research it, those are the best. Mine aren't all from that direction. My German POW has the same name as a relative of mine who I lived with in northern Germany, Dieter Schneider. There was a point where there aren't a lot of race issues in my book, but there's a nice old character who is the farm laborer for decades on the farm. He's a Black man, and I was looking for a name. I realized I needed to come up with a good name for him. And 2 years ago, a fellow moved in across the street from me, African American, and he came over and introduced himself. And he said, "My name is Levotus." And I said, "Thank you. That's exactly the name that I was looking for, Levotus." And so that's that character's name. So it can happen by circumstance too.
Yeah. The protagonist, M. Benbow, in The Great Stork Derby, one thing that he wanted to do was give each of his children an unusual name. he sort of named them alphabetically so he could remember who they were. But each of them had to have a weird name because his was M-E-M-M, and his wife was Zora, which was also a weird name. But he thought if the boys had strange names, it would help them get ahead in the business world. And if the girls had strange names, it would attract unusual husbands. So,
Yeah, very good.
What I think is really fascinating about names is that oftentimes the name that you choose, it has an identity around that's sort of hard boiled into that character and the decisions that they make, and it's almost impossible to imagine them with a different name. And that discovering that throughout the process of crafting the novel is always very interesting. Where this is Cass. It can't be Julie or Marianne or anything else. This is Cass. I just think that's really fascinating. On the flip side of that, to give a character a name is just such a powerful thing that when you're going back through and revising something like a brand new draft, sometimes just renaming a character, a main character, just gives you a whole different feel about what you're doing. It's a very strange dynamic. I'm really fascinated by it.
No, I agree.
Good.
I have, Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just thinking of, I had kind of a last question. I don't think we have any more, but I have one that I'm curious about. I'm always really curious about is what is the strangest or most surprising thing that you learned when writing the book? The one thing that was just, really upside the head kind of moment.
Well, I'll say for me, it was the history that I had to research. I don't. One of the unique things about my book is two pieces of history that people just don't know about, which is the incredible impact of German U-boats up and down the east coast of America in the early part of World War II, and how many hundreds of vessels were sunk, including some that were innocent citizens, innocent civilian vessels. So that was one, and also the huge presence of German POWs across America who were brought to be farm laborers primarily. At one point, there were 200,000 German prisoners working on farms in the 1940s. So those two things were really astounding to me and encouraged me to write the book.
Yeah, it needs to be a movie. I haven't seen a movie like that. That's interesting. We're ready. We're ready for the movie, Russ, even before the book comes out.
I think for me, the interesting thing that I learned was the book is set in Toronto, and going through the periods like the Depression, World War II, all the social upheaval of the 60s, seeing those learning those from a Canadian point of view, as opposed to an American point of view, was really interesting. For example, the Canadian take on Patty Hearst, compared to the way that we saw it in this country. So just trying to get into a Canadian frame of mind about issues that I'd mostly thought about from an American, a United States point of view, or maybe you get the world point of view on BBC, but you always, Canada, and I live just across the border from Canada. You figure sort of one and the same, but in many ways not at all. So for me, that was a surprise.
How about you, Frederick or Kate? I don't think you've gone, or Joanne, anything?
Well, I think for me, it was maybe the reaction of distant relatives who I didn't really think about, perhaps the reaction to the book, who would contact me and have a comment or share a story. So that, and because whether it was after the book was published or when parts were published earlier. So that was kind of interesting.
Nobody yelled at you, did they?
No,
Good.
no. luckily.
Family history can be a little touchy. So yes.
Yes, indeed.
Okay.
Even fiction, family members and friends automatically, they'll see a character and think that it's them, that you've based it on them. And their feathers can get really ruffled, if they don't like it. So, whether it's fiction or not, you just can't win. And even when you say, no, it's not you, it's from my imagination, and they'll just, that's me. So it's an occupational hazard.
How about you, Fred? Sorry, I keep wanting to call you Fred, if that's okay, Frederick.
Oh,
Go ahead.
yeah, no, either way is fine.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the ending to Blood Up North kind of took me by surprise because I had everything mapped out getting up to that point, and then the final twist was something that occurred to me in the moment, and I really liked it, and it stuck. It was something that took me by surprise, but that's a really common thing in writing, or things just kind of are coming together on some level, and you realize it down the road.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, I will say that my book is very autobiographical, and actually the things that surprised me the most were from writing the story, I came to see my own past differently. I came to sort of see it from the perspective of other people. So that was the thing that was most surprising to me. In a way, it was kind of freeing, I would say.
Yeah, very nice.
Yeah, so I've been reading some books by Melissa Febos, and she talks about writing as healing, and I feel like it can definitely serve that function.
I think writing memoir definitely is. Joanne, you probably felt that too. And that's part of the reason to do it, so long as you get to the point where you actually work through everything, so it leaves you with a sense, you and your readers with a sense of peace rather than bitterness, right? If you're still at the bitterness stage, then you're not done yet. That memoir isn't done.
Yeah,
so.
I think for me, I don't write about the difficult things until they don't have an emotional resonance really anymore. I've had people say, oh, you should write about that. And I think, yeah, maybe in 10 years. But for me,
Right.
it really takes,
Right.
And some people do it completely opposite.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you,
Really
everyone.
fascinating. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for answering my question.
Okay, so do we have any more questions, or are we?
I don't think we do. Are there any that came to you ahead of time, and maybe one more that you wanted to put in, or?
Well, I had one. I was wondering how people react when you tell them that you're a writer. I know that people look at me like I'm a magician. It's almost like saying, "Oh, I do magic tricks." So I'm wondering, when somebody says, "What do you do?" and you say, "I'm a writer," what kind of reaction do you get?
My answer is super quick. It's if it had been 20 years ago, they would have said, oh, writer, because it was really hard to get published. But now that anybody can publish, they're like, so what are you doing this weekend? They just, anybody can do it. It's, they're just hoping you won't ask them to read your book, just in case they don't like it, what have you. It's funny. All the shine is off.
Well, anyone can publish themselves, but it's not easy to get published otherwise. So when I say that to people, they just go, "Oh," they don't know what to ask, and then they ask, "What do you write?" And they're interested because it's not the kind of answer that they're used to getting, and so they find it unusual.
I think I avoid the answer. for the most part.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. I think if we don't have any more questions, Ian is a member of our chat tonight, and he has a panel that's coming up. He is a fellow member for anybody who is new in this group tonight. He is another fellow member of Vine Leaves Press, and he and his panel of authors will be up shortly. So he is offering his detail, which is in the chat now, including apparently the Zoom link. So if you'd like to check out the description, it's right there. So it goes into
when we finish up, take a little break and then come right back for that next session. Okay, so I would like to just close out by thanking my fellow authors, our audience, and Leo Tolstoy for today's lively event. And I'll close with a definition from the American Psychological Association. A dysfunctional family is one in which relationships or communication are impaired and members are unable to attain closeness or self-expression. Members of a dysfunctional family often develop symptomatic behaviors, and one individual may present as the identified patient. We could say the book's protagonists are patients, while literature is a form of therapy. In truth, each of us is a patient at some time in our lives. I hope that writing and reading help you to heal. Thanks again from the six of us, from Vine Leaves Press, and the generous hosts who organized this book fair.
Bye, everybody.
thank you so much for coming. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
And thank
Good
you
night.
for a wonderful job moderating.
Thanks, Anne.
Thanks for
Thanks,
everybody's
Russ.
help.
Great company to be.
Thanks,
with.
everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
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 So,
Sorry about that, Kate.
no worries, no
The
worries.
thing just popped up as direct message to you. So if you could tell my mom bye for me, that'd be great.
So Russ, does this mean that everyone can still hear us?
Yes,
Oh, okay. All right.
I have not ended the webinar. So
All right.
just in case folks wanted to take Ian's information off before the
Okay.
chat disappears.
All right.
But
So
I
Russ,
think that's,
thank you so much, both of you. You did a lot of work and it went really smoothly. Thank you.
welcome. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you so much for the support and help. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I loved hearing everybody's answers to the questions. I think we got to know each other better too.
Yes.
Yeah, it
All
was
right.
fun. Thank you. All right.
All right.
Have a good
I'll
night.
see you. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.